We're doing lab exercise 9 over nerves and neurons in the brain, cranial nerves and spinal nerves. So there's plenty of material to be covered, and so let's see how we can get through this. One of the things, nucleus is spelled N-U-C-L-E-U-S, not that way, and nucleolus. So nucleus and nucleolus are two different things. The nucleolus is the RNA that's inside of the nucleus, and it's the thing that's making the ribosomes. We're going to learn about supporting cells, and they're called glial cells or neuroglia. And then hopefully in lecture you're learning the different types of supporting cells. So let's get started with this. Alright, here you have a nerve cell, and this whole thing right here is considered to be the cell body. So that would be the cell where you would find your mitochondria, your endoplasmic reticulum, and all the things you normally find inside of a cell. There's the nucleus, and then there is the nucleolus. So the arrows are a little bit confusing on there, so pay attention. Number 3 is the cell body, or the main part of the neuron, and the nucleus is 2, so it is pointing to the larger nuclear envelope enclosed area, and then number 1 is the nucleolus. All of these other things are going to be your axons and your dendrites. So you have these processes extending away. Now, axons carry the message away from the cell body, and dendrites bring the message into the cell body. If you look out here at the little specks here, 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 and here, there are little tiny support cells that I was talking about, the astrocytes, and we're going to learn about oligodendrocytes and other support cells. But these glial cells you can only see in this particular slide by their nucleus. Now, when they looked at Einstein's brain, he didn't have any more neurons than anyone else. He had the same number. But when they looked at the support cells and the connections that the support cells made between his neurons, they found that he had way more connectors than most other people have. So that may be one of the reasons why he could think outside the box and see things that no one else saw. All right, moving on. All right, here is the brain, and handily, we already know a bunch of the different parts of the brain because we know about the frontal lobe, and we know about the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe. So we already know that because that's also the name of the bones, and so it makes it kind of handy that we already know a little bit about this stuff. So if we make this a little smaller, and we can look at the cheat sheet down here and see which ones that we need to know. Let's try that again. All right, and lo and behold, there we go. Frontal lobe is this one. The parietal is this one right here, and occipital again in the back. You never want to hit somebody in the back of the head really hard because this is the area that understands what the eyes see. So you'll go blind if you are damaged in this part of your brain, in the occipital lobe. The lateral sulcus runs right there. So if it goes down and makes a little valley, it's called a sulcus, and if it sticks up and bulges, it's called a gyrus. So all of these are sticking out, and all of these are folds. And I need to show you, if I can make my computer behave. This is mislabeled. This is not the central sulcus. The central sulcus is back here, and it extends all the way down to number 14. So that one is mislabeled, but it's close enough that if someone asks you what is that line right there, you go, well, I guess you mean the central sulcus right there. And it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. All right, let's see what other fun things we're supposed to know. All right, so we know the lateral and the cerebellum. The cerebrum is this whole thing. That's the part that does the thinking. That's why we're considered to be cerebral, because we think with this part. And then you have the cerebellum, and it's more for balance. Then you have the pons, which is this part right here. And then coming on down, you have the medulla oblongata. Now, they're showing you two different nerves right here. So we're going to learn the cranial nerves in a minute, and they're showing you two of them on this particular slide. So number 2 is the optic nerve. So this is the one that goes out to your eyeballs. And then you have your olfactory nerves, which are right there. And let's see, did we cover everything? We didn't do the... Here is the transverse fissure. It's labeled number 16 right here, and it separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. And if you're going to get something confused, you'll probably get the transverse fissure, which is rather deep, with number 14, which is the lateral sulcus. So they both look like little trenches right there. But one of them is much deeper, and so that's the fissure. And it's the transverse fissure and the lateral sulcus. So don't get those two mixed up right there. And then the central sulcus is the one that's mislabeled, and it's the one that comes down right here and meets 14 right there, the lateral sulcus. And number 6 is randomly pointing to one of these parts that's sticking out. It's a gyrus. But it would be easy to mistake that for the frontal lobe. So, but number 1 is the frontal lobe. So make sure that you get your 6 and your 1 straight. 1 is indicating the area, the frontal lobe, and 6 is actually just pointing at one of these folds. But the 6 could be pointing to any of these folds because they're all considered to be gyrus, G-Y-R-U-S, right there, gyrus. All right. Here's a cross section of the brain. So you've probably heard about people being right brain or left brain. So there's actually a division between the two hemispheres of the brain, and the bridge between the two is this thing right here, the corpus callosum. So it looks just like a band right here, but if you can imagine it extending back down in and then across and over into the other hemisphere. And sometimes if people have whole brain seizures, they can cut the corpus callosum and it'll stop the seizure from moving over into the other hemisphere. So, but that's under really, life-threatening situations. So you wouldn't just normally go around cutting that part. So the corpus callosum kind of ties the two hemispheres together. Now, looking here on the inside, we have the same stuff that we had on the other one. So here's your frontal lobe right there. And here's your parietal lobe up here. And back here's your occipital lobe. So there's a lot of repetition in this. So that makes it a little bit easier on us. And let's see. If we look right here at number 19, this is the thalamus. The thalamus. And underneath it, the word beneath is hypo. So there's the hypothalamus. And if you can imagine, right underneath the hypothalamus is the optic chiasm. And if you think about it, you have two eyes, and coming out of the back of each of your eyes is the optic nerve. So you've got one from each eye, and it comes together and meets at the optic chiasma. So that's what 24 is right there. And there's another picture that kind of shows the optic chiasm a little bit better than this one. So it actually is like a U-shaped area, because it's where the intersection of the two optic nerves coming from the eye, where they meet. And if we had it in this picture, underneath the hypothalamus and connected to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. So you have your thalamus, your hypothalamus, your optic chiasm, where the two optic nerves meet, and then directly underneath it is the pituitary. But it's been removed in this particular picture, apparently. All right. If you cut open the cerebellum, it has this gorgeous tree-like structure, and they call that the arbor vitae, or the tree of life. So there's your tree of life in the cerebellum. And of course, 35 is the cerebellum there, and 36 is the pons, and down here is the medulla oblongata again. But now we're going to look up inside. We couldn't see these things before, so we're going to name some of these structures in here. And one of them is the pineal gland, also called the pineal gland, and it's very, 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 very tiny right there, 23, and it's the thing that takes care of your circadian rhythms. So if you've heard people say, oh, I'm going to take melatonin because I'm having trouble getting used to daylight savings time, or I have seasonal affective disorder, which is SAD, S-A-D, seasonal affective disorder, and I need to take something to cheer me up, because I just get so depressed when it's dark and cold and gloomy, and so I take melatonin. So this is the little gland right there, the part of the brain that makes melatonin. But you need sunlight to influence it. So obviously when your days are shorter versus when your days are longer, you're going to have a different effect out of the pineal gland or the pineal gland. All right, what else do we need? So here again, we talked about on the other picture, number 2 is the optic nerve, and number 1 is the olfactory nerve. And again, olfactory means smell. So this is the one that would be talking to your nose and helping you smell. So when we're starting to learn the cranial nerves, number 1 and number 2 are pretty easy, olfactory and cranial. Olfactory and optic are those. So we only have a couple more terms to learn. One of them is, it should be rather obvious, if you know that this is the occipital region and this is the parietal region, then this division right here that they painted in with a black Sharpie and then they labeled 15 is the parieto-occipital sulcus. So it is the dent between the gyrus, the downward valley, or whatever you want to call it, between the two sticking up gyrus, and it separates the optic area, the occipital region, with the parietal region. So there's a new thing for you to look at right there. And then if we go right in through here, so we've got 30, 31, and 32. So 30 is superior and 31 is inferior. So the closer you are to the top of the head, you are considered to be superior, and if you are below it, you're inferior. So that's the easy part, superior and inferior. And then you get the colliculus of the corpora quadrigemina. So how's that So try saying that really, really fast, or after you've had a beer. It just won't happen. And then 32 is considered to be the midbrain. So it's behind the pons. Right here's the pons. So it's behind that, and it's above the medulla oblongata, which is right here, this part. So there's your midbrain. There's your superior and inferior colliculus of corpora quadrigemina. And that should be about everything on that particular slide. I had to really look at this sheep brain to get the orientation. So this is a little bit mislabeled, which is a little hard. And then they've left the dura mater on. So they want you to see that. So your brain is actually in a very tough sac. And it's got 3 layers. And there's the outer layer, which is the dura mater, and that literally means tough mother. So it is the outer thick layer, and then underneath it is the arachnoid area, and the arachnoid mater, and then touching the actual sulci and gyrus is the pia mater, or the loving mother. So this thing right here, and there's some of it here, they've ripped it open so you can see down inside of it, but this would be continuous, and you need that because it forms the blood-brain barrier. So you've heard the blood-brain barrier, and it holds the fluid so that the brain is actually sort of suspended in fluid, and it has fluid running around in the ventricles. So it's important that this be intact and protect the brain. But in this picture, they've torn it apart. Now, underneath here, if you could pull this back, you'll see the longitudinal fissure that's going to divide the 2 hemispheres right there. So it's unfortunate that they didn't pull this down just a little bit so you can see the fissure, but they say it's right there. So if you orient yourself right there with the fissure, then you should be able to see, okay, there's the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is right there. And if you can kind of put the ears back on the sheep, then you can see the temporal lobe that's kind of over here. And the occipital lobe, again, is back here. So frontal, occipital, parietal on either side of the longitudinal fissure. And then the temporal lobe is more over the ears. And then there's the cerebellum for balance. There's the medulla oblongata. And they're not showing you the pons in this particular orientation because we're kind of looking on the top down. And they're showing you some more gyrus and some more sulcus. So, gyrus is singular, gyri, and sulcus is singular, sulcus. Excuse me, sorry. When you put the I on, it's plural. Sulcus is singular. I just checked with Alexa to see how you would say the plural of S-U-L-C-I, and she pronounced it sulci. I always pronounce it sulky. So, there you go. Who's right, me or Alexa? Now, moving down to this other picture, you can easily see the optic chiasma right there. So it's kind of hard to see in that other picture because we just saw a little bit of it right there. And then they were showing you the optic nerve. So it wasn't really obvious. But when you look at the underside like this, it's very easy to see. And so there's your spinal cord, your medulla oblongata. Here's your pons. And the cerebellum here is back there. So we're looking at the underside. We've cut the spinal cord and we're actually looking up inside the underside of the sheep brain. All right, the olfactory bulb. So this is going to be where they're smelling. And the pituitary gland is right there. Now the sheep is similar to us, but it's not exactly the same. So it's a little bit different. And there's your parietal lobes right there. So there's just a few things. The pituitary, unfortunately, again, they left the dura mater on top of it. So it's a little bit hard to see. Here is another orientation. This is a slice through the sheep brain. And let's orient ourselves with the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe back here, transverse fissure, the one that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. There's the arbor vitae. So this is actually a picture of a real brain. That's kind of neat. Again, spinal cord, medulla, pons. Now, here you can see a little bit more easily when you have the cross section. Here's your pituitary gland right here. And you know that separating the pituitary gland from the hypothalamus is the optic chiasma. So there it is, right there. Optic chiasma. Hypothalamus is right above it. And of course, hypo means below. So above that would be the thalamus. Right here, and the corpus callosum, they had to cut to separate the left and the right hemisphere. So there's the cerebrum, and there's the olfactory bulb again, right there. So remember when we were looking, you have the optic nerve, and then you have the olfactory, which is the sense of smell. So the only thing that you might there's your pineal or pineal body right there. So who knew that sheep were moody and were affected by daylight? So I wonder if they need melatonin too. And there's your superior and inferior colliculus of the corpora quadrigemina. There are 12 pair of cranial nerves, and they have a number, 1 through 12, in Roman numerals. Right there they are. And then they also have a name, and we've been talking about the olfactory and the optic for quite some time now. And then over here is the function. Well, obviously the olfactory does smell, and the optic nerve does vision. But now you get into the other cranial nerves coming out of the brain. And when we were talking about cells earlier on, I said in my day we talked about nerve cells. And you're not allowed to say nerve cells anymore. You have to call them neurons. And the reason for that is because when you have a bunch of axons coming together for a common purpose, we call that a nerve. So what we're talking about here, the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve, you're actually talking about a bundle of axons that are traveling to some part of the body. So these are the ones that are going to go mostly to the face. And it's interesting to me how many of them have to do with the movement of your eye. So number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. So that's kind of easy. Oculo would be eye, and motor would be movement. So it allows your eye to go superior, inferior, medially. And then number 4 is the trochlear nerve, also involved with movement of the eye. And number 5 is one of the more interesting of the nerves because it comes out and branches into 3 branches. That's why it's the trigeminal nerve. And if you put your palm of your hand over your ear and you take your first 3 fingers and you put one finger up close to your eye, the second finger down closer to your nose, and the third finger down underneath your lips. That's where the 3 of the trigeminal nerves go. And if you get it inflamed, there's a condition called tic douloureux. And, you always hear people going, well, childbirth is the most painful thing you can do. And they go, no, passing a kidney stone is the most painful thing you can ever do. And a lot of people will tell you that having an inflamed trigeminal nerve is the most painful thing that you can ever do. So in the case of an inflammation of that trigeminal nerve, even wind blowing on your face will set you screaming. And they actually say that people have committed suicide because the pain is so unrelenting. So anyway, I thought that was a kind of interesting thing. And it also has been implicated in migraines. So the trigeminal nerve, number 5, is one of my favorite. I guess if you can have a favorite, I think that one's kind of cool. All right, number 6 is the abducens nerve, and it's for lateral movement of the eye. So on the test, if you're like, gosh, what is the function of that cranial nerve? You've got like a 50-50 chance if you say, well, it controls the eye. So anyway, be careful. Oculomotor, that's definitely movement of eye. So number 3 is pretty easier. Trochlear, not as obvious. Trigeminal, again, that one runs across your face, your cheeks, and down into your chin. So it has sensations of pain, as I said. Touch, so you know when someone's caressing your cheek. It also can monitor whether or not you're running a temperature, and since it goes down below your chin, below your lips, then it is involved with chewing also. All right, so abducens, lateral movement of the eye. The facial nerve is number 7, and it has your facial expressions. So it controls your frowning and such. And it also controls the secretion of your saliva and your tears, and it's in charge of your sense of taste. Now that would be interesting to see, because one of the things that happens when people have COVID is they lose their sense of taste. So it'd be interesting if anybody's looked at the facial nerve to see if that has anything to do with it. But that's number 7, the facial nerve. And the vestibulocochlear nerve has to do with inside your ear. So it is hearing and balance. So the vestibulocochlear nerve is in charge of hearing and balance. The glossopharyngeal nerve has to do with the sense of taste and the secretion of saliva. Now, we just said that number 7 secretes saliva, and now we're saying that number 9 also does. So be aware that you have more than one in charge of saliva and the sense of taste. So pay attention right there to those 2. All right, the vagus nerve. This is the one that contracts and relaxes your smooth muscles and is your sensory receptor of your visceral organs. So when we looked at the muscle tissue in the last lab, we looked at smooth muscle, striated muscle, and cardiac muscle. So the vagus nerve, is going to be the one that talks to your smooth muscle. So it's going to be very, very important. All right, and then coming down to number 11, the accessory nerve allows you to swallow and to move your head. And then the hypoglossal nerve is moving your tongue. So number 12 is moving your tongue. So there are mnemonics. On occasion, our trusty truck acts funny. Very good vehicle anyhow. So if one of those helps you, otherwise make flashcards, do whatever. 1 is easy, olfactory. 2 is easy, optic nerve. 3, oculomotor. Okay, so that's your eyes. Number 3. Number 4, trochlear. I don't know how you're going to memorize that one. So you just sit there and think about it. Think about it. Number 4 is trochlear. Number 4 is trochlear. Trigeminal, that's the fun one. It branches out into 3 places on your face and can be unbelievably painful if it's inflamed and very, very sensitive. So the lightest touch on your cheek or your chin you can feel. And then of course for chewing. Alright, so anyway, those are the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So you have 2 of them, 1 for each side. Remember, you got 2 hemispheres. So you've got pairs of cranial nerves, and they have Roman numerals and names, and this is what they do. So we talked about the 12 cranial nerves in a table, and here we're actually going to put this together. So there's your optic nerve. Again, that one's pretty easy to figure out, and it points out that the olfactory nerve, which is nerve number 1, isn't visible on this particular model because it is in the anterior inferior surface of the brain, and so it's not present on the brainstem model. Alright, and then coming down, number 3, remember that was your oculomotor, and your trochlears, number 4, your trigeminals, number 5. So they numbered them in the order that you run into them, so that makes it a little bit easier. And your facial, well, the vestibular cochlear, facial, abductions, glossopharyngeal, vagus, hypoglossal, and accessory. And notice how the accessories do like that. So accessory is going to be one of the more easy ones for you to see. Alright, here's the spinal cord model, and here are the things that you need to learn about the spinal cord. So first of all, it's really important that you know which is the front of the vertebra and which is the back. So, because they're going to be talking about anterior, which of course will be in the front, and then posterior, which will be in the back. So this part is the front or the anterior region, and there's the posterior region. So you need to orient yourself when you look at this so you know which way is which. And then we get into these various layers. So as you're coming in, remember the tough mother, the dura mater. So this is number 9. Right there, there's the tough mother. Now that was surrounding the brain, but it extends on down and also surrounds the spinal column. So it kind of separates the nervous system from the rest of the body, and that's kind of important so that we don't get viruses and bacteria and things into our nervous system. So we need the tough mother to protect us. And then underneath that is the arachnoid area, and then the subarachnoid area. So you kind of see a gap here, and that's the subarachnoid space. So instead of just having the 3 layers in close contact with each other, you have a gap between the arachnoid and the pia mater, or the loving mother, that is covering the spinal cord. Alright, down here, right here, you have the anterior median fissure. So remember, I told you a fissure is deep. So this thing is this deep. It goes all the way in to the middle, and then this is the central canal. That makes it kind of easy. And this is the dorsal horn. back here, the dorsal horn, and the, let's see. Before I start talking about the spinal cord, we need to look at a couple of more spaces that I left off. So number 10 is the epidural space. Epi means upon. So this is actually on top of the dura mater, or the tough mother, right there. And you guys may not know about epidurals, but women are very much aware of this. If you can put something, a numbing agent, in the epidural region during childbirth, it will numb the feeling and you can have painless childbirth. So women are very, very interested in having an epidural to numb that whole give So from where you infuse it into the epidural region, that area on down will go to sleep and give you plenty of time to push the baby out. So, like I said, women can tell you all about it, men not so much. So epi means upon the dura, epidural. And then underneath the tough mother, the dura mater, is the subdural space. And you've probably heard of somebody saying, oh my goodness, they got hit and they got a subdural hematoma. So they're actually bleeding into this area right there. So it's hard to see right there. They said that they've drawn it in with a red line so you can kind of see it. But if you can orient yourself with the dura mater, then the subdural, then the arachnoid, then the subarachnoid, and then the loving mother. And the loving mother, the pia mater, is always in close contact with either the brain or the spine. So it's pretty easy to get. And now let's look at this. So if you have a bundle of axons, we call it I have trouble with this. It's a funiculus. So the one that's going to be in the front is going to be the anterior funiculus. There's that bundle. The one that's on the side is going to be the lateral funiculus, and 32 is the posterior funiculus. So that's why it's so important that you know which is the front and which is the back when you're looking at the spinal column. The dorsal horn is the thing that I look for. It's the first thing. So even if I didn't have the vertebra to orient me to which way was which, this dorsal horn looks like a butterfly. Anyway, so the long part that goes all the way out to the pia mater, that's the one that is the dorsal. So that's the one that's going to be in the back. So maybe that'll help you to remember. So look, because they have 9, 10, and 11 labeled here, and they also have 9, 11, 12, 13 labeled down here. So they're the same thing. It's just you've got a circle, and so they labeled it at the top and the bottom. So just don't let that throw you right there. So we've done all of these except for the posterior median sulcus right there. So the sulcus is not deep. Look at that. That fissure right there is deep, and the pia mater goes in. And here the pia mater does not go in. It just kind of dips in. It makes a little valley there. Right there. So, if you're going to mix something up, you probably are going to mix up the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus. So just remember, one of them is a fissure, one of them is a sulcus. And then you've got your three. I have so much trouble with that word. Funiculus, anterior, lateral, and posterior. And of course the central canal is easy. So there you have it on that. Here we have a model where they've stripped away the bone. So all you're looking at is a spinal column. So like I said, I always orient myself with the dorsal horn. There it is. So I know that this is the back. And since I know this is the back, then I know that this area is going to be the posterior funiculus. Here's the lateral, and then there's the anterior. So same thing we were looking at before. Number 9 is not so obvious, but it's the central canal. It would be nice if there was actually a hole there, so you could see that it is indeed a canal. But in this particular model, the angle that the picture's taken, you don't see the hole right there. All right, and then we are looking at the lateral horn, the anterior horn, the gray commissure, and the posterior horn. Most people call it the dorsal horn, but either one's correct. I looked it up. Posterior or dorsal, either one is fine. Lateral on the side, dorsal or posterior in the back, anterior in the front, and then you just have to remember the gray commissure. Gray commissure. So that's a new term that we've not run into. Now, as you look at these axons, bundles of axons coming out, you see this bulge right here. That's actually got some cell bodies in there. And so 24 is your dorsal root ganglion. So it's in the back. It's in the back, so it's dorsal, not in the front. And there's your ventral root. So as you're coming out between the lateral and anterior, you're going to have your ventral root. And then back here where there's your posterior, that's where you're going to have your dorsal root. So that's one of the reasons I call it the dorsal horn. All right. And then you come on out from this where these two come together, and this is going to be one of your spinal nerves. So we talked about 12 cranial nerves, and we looked at where they came off from out of the brain. But now we're going down the spinal column, and we're going to talk about spinal nerves. And these are the ones that go out to your arms and your legs and your toes. So I think we've gotten everything on this one. There's your posterior median sulcus and your anterior median fissure again. So keep those in mind. But it's always important to orient yourself. These little asterisks are showing you white matter versus gray matter. So whenever you're seeing gray matter, you're actually looking at nerve cell bodies. And when you're looking at white matter, you're looking at axons, and they are covered with a myelin sheath, which makes them look white. So that's why they have the little stars by them. So the funiculus, the word that I have so much trouble saying, is a bundle of axons. And since it's a bundle of axons, it has a white covering on it. You really shouldn't have too much trouble with this particular picture. There's a couple of words that you have not talked about before, but when you look at them, it's really, really obvious. So back in the picture before, we saw where you had the dorsal ganglia and the ventral root joining together to make a spinal nerve. And here's the spinal nerves coming out of each of the vertebra. So this is why it's important. If you hurt the spinal column, the spinal nerves from there on down don't work. So that's where you get, if you break your neck in the cervical region, you will either, depending on where you break it, you're either dead or you are quadriplegic. You're paralyzed both arms and legs. And then if you break it lower down, then your legs are paralyzed. So as you come down the spinal column, you get to what they call the cauda equina, or horse's tail. Equina means horse. So there's the horse's tail, and it branches off, and then it joins together out here to make the sacral plexus. So a plexus is a union out here. So the horse's tail, the cauda equina, is right there. The sacral plexus on both sides. And then the phylum terminal. So the very end of the horse's tail is all the way down there by the coccyx. Down there. So phylum terminal and cauda equina, or horse's tail. Here we're looking at the same terms we've been looking at before, but in this case, this is the real deal. This is actually a slice of a real spinal column, and looking at it under the microscope, it's quite interesting. So orient yourself here. There's your central canal. It's quite obvious. It's a canal. And then you have a distinct fissure right there. So that's your anterior median fissure. Anterior because it's at the front of the spinal column, and median because it's in the middle, and fissure because it's deep. And so opposite that would be the posterior median sulcus right there. And if this picture went on up, you would see that it dents in right there. The pia mater just makes like a little V right there. All right, there's your dorsal horn. Remember, dorsal and posterior can be used interchangeably. So you're going to hear me call it dorsal horn because that's the way I've always called it, and it comes out and you have the dorsal ganglia. So it just makes more sense to me to be consistent and call the whole mess dorsal. Then remember, you have your bundles of axons here, here, and here. So this one's going to be your anterior bunch and your lateral bunch and your posterior bunch. So that makes that kind of easy. And those are the funiculus. I'm getting better at saying it. And you have the dorsal or posterior, anterior, and see if we can scroll down just a smidgen. The lateral horn right there out to the side, and anterior horn. And they don't have the gray commissure right there. But anyway, oh, never mind. There it is, number 2. I was looking on the wrong side because it's on both sides, both hemispheres. All right, so there you go. Here's another slice. This one happens to have the outer covering over it. So you can see the dura mater, and then directly under the dura mater is the arachnoid mater, and then 12 is your subarachnoid space. 11 is your loving mother, the pia mater. Again, central canal, the fissure, the sulcus, and the dorsal horn coming out there. So that one, again, same old, same old. It's just a little bit different picture, and it shows you with the covering over the spinal column, the tough mother, the dura mater. So you don't have to know the names of all the spinal nerves. We just picked a handful of them for you to be able to know. And remember, where spinal nerves come together and join together, it makes a plexus. a plexus. Instead of a ganglion, it makes a plexus. So the cervical plexus, obviously, is in the cervical region. Coming on down, you have the brachial plexus. You guys remember that your armpit is your axillary region. So you're going to have the axillary nerve, spinal nerve, coming out in that area. And then the radial nerve is going to come down towards the thumb. And it took me the longest time staring at this picture to figure out what the heck's going on, because here's the guy's thumb. So you would think that the radial nerve would be illustrated over on this side, but what they did was they flipped the guy's hand over here, and then they cut his thumb off right there. So it was hard to orient myself using this particular picture, because one hand is in this orientation and the other hand is flipped over. But anyway, you know that the radial is going to go down towards the thumb, because I've just said that so many times. And then the ulnar is going to be closer to the little finger. And the musculocutaneous, all right, musculo is muscle, cutaneous is skin. So this one's going to come out this way. Here is the lumbar plexus. So if you remember the various types of vertebra, we had the cervical, right there, the cervical, and then the lumbar, and there's the sacral plexus right there. And the sciatic nerve, that's the one. So many old people have sciatica. They have an inflammation of the sciatic nerve. A lot of times it's because they have arthritis in their vertebra. And a lot of times it's because they don't exercise. So sciatica is very prevalent in older people. And if you guys remember, we did the obturator, and look at there's the obturator spinal nerve. So a lot of times the bones and the nerves and the muscles are all named after the same area. There's the femoral right there, the tibial right there. So make sure you know where the sciatic nerve is, so you know if you have sciatica when you get older. Hopefully you wait till you get older. And the last one is the peroneal.